fellowship at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, and that was also 3 years.
All right. What position do you hold now? Who's your employer?
My employer is Emory University, Department of Pediatrics in the School of Medicine.
How long have you been employed there in that capacity?
I've been there for 15 years since I finished my fellowship at St. Jude.
What certifications do you hold?
I'm board certified in pediatrics as well as pediatric hematology and oncology.
Okay. Is that a very large field of medicine?
It's not particularly large. There are probably a couple thousand of us across the United States, not a huge number, maybe 1,000 to 2,000.
In your career, how many cases have you been involved in that involve pediatric cancers?
Pediatric cancers entirely, probably from new diagnoses that I personally take care of have been about 60 a year for the last 15 years. And within the last 5 years, I've specialized down into extremely rare pediatric cancers, so cancers that only occur about 100 times a year in the United States. Same numbers, but more specialized.
Okay. All right. Did you have the opportunity to meet Isaiah Wimbush in your professional capacity?
Yes, in 11 of 2014, we first met Isaiah when he was referred to us for an abdominal mass that had just undergone biopsy by pediatric surgery.
Okay, so by the time you saw him, will you describe briefly the procedure that he had already had before you saw him?
Certainly. Dr. Santori had seen him. He was referred to pediatric surgery for an abdominal mass that was visible on his skin. Dr. Santori had gotten an ultrasound which showed it to be soft and solid. So he then took the child to the operating room, made an incision over the primary mass, which was about 5 by 7 centimeters, and biopsied the lesion, which means that he took a small piece of the lesion for analysis under the microscope.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayfield, are you offering this witness as an expert in any capacity?
Yes, Your Honor. There's no requirement that he be tendered as such, but I will be certainly glad to do so.
Okay.
I tender this witness as an expert in pediatric oncology.
All right. Any objection to this witness being offered as an expert in pediatric oncology? No objection. All right, thank you. He'll be so deemed to be an expert in that field.
Okay. So I think I asked you to describe, or I think you just did describe the biopsy.
So the biopsy was taken a small piece for analysis under the microscope.
So was this biopsy's intent to cure him of this cancer?
It was intent to diagnose him of what this was. At that time, it was not known that this was a malignancy.
Okay. Let me show you what's been marked and tendered as exhibit number 26. Do you recognize that to be the condition, the lesion, as you described, only would have been before the biopsy?
Correct.
What's the only difference between the way that we see this picture now and the way that you observed him after the biopsy was done?
The biopsy was done over this portion of the lesion, and here there was a scar, and this mass was absent, but this mass was present at the time of our exam.
All right. Let's talk about then the way that he was referred to you for your assistance. Of the cancers that you have seen, will you describe if a presentation like this one, particularly meaning the size of the mass, is typical or atypical of the patients that come to you?
Sure. So it is not atypical to find large masses, but those masses are generally not visible or not palpable. In other words, when we have a mass occur in a large cavity like the abdominal cavity, masses may need to get very large before someone can actually notice them. However, masses on the skin are generally brought to our attention relatively quickly. So as I've said, I've taken care of rare tumors, dermatofibrosarcoma protuberans. The name of this tumor is rare. It's a rare sarcoma.
You may need to spell that, please, for the court reporter.
I apologize. So actually, if I can change the name, because it was actually called a giant cell fibroblastoma. So giant cells clear, Fibroblastoma for fibroblastoma.
Thank you.
No problem. And so that tumor occurs probably 20 to 50 times a year in the United States in kids. Again, a rare tumor. I've taken care of 16 of these patients, and by far, this tumor was the most extensive giant cell fibroblastoma that I've ever seen present at this stage.
Okay. What is a typical presentation?
Generally somewhere between 1 and 5 centimeters. At the time that a mass presents, the parents will seek care, and someone will acknowledge that this is abnormal and refer to appropriate specialists, whether it be dermatology, pediatric surgery, oncology, or even just imaging.
For the rest of us that never converted to the metric system, can you give us some, maybe a coin size or something that might relate to the typical presentation that you see?
Sure. I'm sorry. About 2.5 centimeters is 1 inch. So if we start thinking about this, usually somewhere between, depending on the aggressiveness of the parent, right? I mean, I've had dermatofibrosarcomas present at well under 1 centimeter, so 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch, and parents have brought that to someone's attention. Generally no more than 1/4, at most $50, and that's usually if it's in a undisclosed location, a hidden location. These masses grow very slowly, so for them to hit 1/4 or a $50 size would generally take years usually.
Okay. Now, to testify today, have you reviewed the medical records of Emory University?
Yes.
And did Isaiah have treatment at other locations as well?
Yes, so he was with us between 11 of 2014 and 5, 2015, and at that time he went to go live with his cousin near Tampa, I believe. He was followed at All Saints in Tampa by another pediatric oncology group.
Okay. Have you reviewed those medical records from that hospital and those physicians?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And are those medical records the type of medical records that you regularly rely upon when you are treating patients?
Yes.
Okay. So, doctor, this tumor that was presented, we have this large, visible, dark, rough mass that we can see. Tell us what's really going on with that tumor.
So this tumor is what's called a sarcoma. So a sarcoma is a cancer of that tissue that fills us out, muscles, the tissue underneath the skin, tendons, that kind of thing. What happens is a single cell turns into this cancer, and then it begins to grow. But this one grows very, very slowly. What we know is that by the time we see height to the tumor, right, if we see a mass that may measure 1 to 2 centimeters, what we have to be worried about is that this tumor tends to grow sideways. It tends to grow between tissue planes. So for example, we know our belly is divided into tissue planes. We have the skin, we have some fascia, we have muscle, we have the peritoneal cavity. And those things grow or establish themselves sideways. If this tumor grows between those planes, it doesn't tend to invade up, it doesn't tend to invade down, it doesn't go through those planes. But what it will do is start to go sideways. And it goes sideways relatively quickly. So that if I see a mass that's 2 centimeters, when we go to resect that mass, we have to be concerned that there may be non-visible tumor, microscopic tumor cells as far as 3 centimeters out from the edge of the mass that we can see. So that when we have to take this out, if we have a 2-centimeter mass, then we have to have a 2-centimeter mass with 3-centimeter additional margins on all sides. So this 2-centimeter mass becomes an 8-centimeter resection. So it becomes very large very quickly in terms of trying to cure this.
Okay. So relate that, if you would, to the size of this tumor that, as it presented to you, to face a surgery with the intent of removing all of it. How large of a space would surgery would be required?
Do you mind if can I have that first picture? Certainly. To demonstrate. Thank you.
And if you would like to, you're welcome to come down and show it.
Okay. Can you all see? Do you want me to come down? Okay. So if we can see here from the mass, we see a visible mass that is actually to the right of the umbilicus. It actually extends beyond the border, the line that goes straight down from the neck down to the belly button. And so we would probably need to go 3 centimeters beyond any visible rise in the skin, okay, from here all the way over to here. And so we're talking about, at this point, an incredibly large defect to fill. In addition to the linear or the sideways, if we go vertically, you can't see the lowest extent because of the pants, but this would also be about half again the size up here as this length. So I believe we measured this out to be about 13 centimeters to begin with. This is about, I think about 4 to 5 maybe, 5 to 6 centimeters as we measured it. And so we would need to be doing a surgical resection that extends far beyond that. Now, we might not have to resect muscle there. That would be the biggest problem. But there's going to be a large skin defect there. That's not something that, once we resect that area, it's not something that we're going to be able to bring skin closure to. So because we just can't put that kind of tension on the skin. We can't pull the skin that far. So we're left with either taking a muscle from another part of the body that has skin over it and moving it, or doing a large skin graft, or something else that requires reconstruction in order to get that out. And it's a very involved surgery or a very involved process.
All right. What is the recovery time for a surgery like that?
And kids heal very quickly. It's amazing. So, I mean, I would still put him at a 6-week average recovery, which would be typical for most surgeries. I mean, when we deal with a skin graft this large, there can be complications, but I couldn't predict that those would occur.
Okay. So he would potentially have how many surgery sites by the time you remove muscle and skin from other places?
Well, ideally, we would want to do it the first time and do it right the first time in one large surgery site. Because if we miss, right, if we do that big surgery and we find that there's still tumor at the edge of the resection, the next surgery has to be 3 centimeters around the entire previous excision area. So if we generate a scar, right, that's this long, and there's still cancer somewhere on that scar, we have to continue to do another excision that uses 3 centimeters around that. So these surgeries go from being this big to this big, to this big very rapidly. So at some point along the way, it would become impossible. Usually with DFSPs we have, with this kind of tumor, with the giant cell fibroblastomas, we generally have 2 to 3 possible attempts. Because of the size of this, we really would have 1 attempt.
Okay. But to bring in a skin graft, would that require a second surgery site on Isaiah's body to remove area?
Sure.
So that you would bring, where would you typically go get that muscle and skin?
Typically, so I'm not a plastic surgeon, but typically that skin is either removed from the belly, which would not be a possibility in this time, or from the thigh. So they might have to do a skin removal thing. It's a machine that slides along the skin, takes off the top layer of skin, and then they spread it. They use a machine to cut the skin so that it can stretch and fill the defect and fill the area. There's a scar left on the thigh where the skin is taken, but there's no actual injury to the leg or to the thigh at that point.
Okay. with a visible tumor like this, what reaction would a trained pediatrician have upon seeing that tumor in an annual child checkup?
Right. I mean, as this picture shows, I mean, any physician who saw that should be referring that child for immediate evaluation. Not urgent, not like emergent evaluation, but immediate evaluation. All right, this is, if someone had seen this in a pediatrics office, I would expect a call, you know, from that physician telling me what to do or asking me what to do at this point.
What about a tumor, as you described, maybe the size of a quarter? How would a pediatrician react?
In general, if this were a mass that were smaller, so let's say it was this, I still feel that pediatricians would have called or at least sought information. They may not have referred to an oncologist because it may not have been as clear at that point, but they certainly would have referred to a pediatric surgeon or someone, or a dermatologist to get a biopsy to evaluate what that is.
Okay. So the visible part of this cancer, does it grow quickly or slowly?
So this cancer is known to grow extremely slowly. Many of the patients that I see have had this for years as a little dot that's slowly grown over time.
I know that every case will vary, but can you make a general statement about how long it might take to go from a quarter size to the size of presentation?
Well, I mean, as I said, this could take years. When we asked the child himself about how long this had been there, the child stated that it's as long as he could remember.
Okay. What alternatives are there to surgery?
So there are two primary alternatives. One is a medicine that we call imatinib or Gleevec. At any rate, it shrinks the tumor in about 50 to 60% of cases. It does not kill the tumor. So, meaning it may reduce the mass of the tumor, but it is not adequate in and of itself to treat the tumor. What we hope to do with that drug is to shrink the size of the tumor to enable a better surgical resection.
Okay.
The other option we have is radiation. If we have an incomplete surgery so that we've taken all the visible mass out, but there is microscopic disease left, then we can radiate the site of the tumor, and that does a pretty good job of controlling the tumor also.
Is Gleevec a generic version of that drug?
Yeah, actually, imatinib is the generic, and Gleevec is the trade name, is the expensive name. Yes.
How is that is that a form of chemotherapy?
It is. I mean, it gets classified that way. It's not the type of chemotherapy that you think of with bald head and IV infusions that we think of with traditional breast cancer or colon cancer. These types of drugs, of which Gleevec was the first, started in 2000 when it came to market. They're called tyrosine kinase inhibitors. They have their own set of side effects, but they are not classic chemotherapy. The people who use them the most, though, are obviously oncologists, and they kind of get grouped all in that area.
All right. What sort of side effects can that have on a child?
So Gleevec can have some height issues. In other words, it can prevent height. It can have liver toxicity, but usually not. It can suppress your bone marrow, so it can make your white cells count drop, so you can be open to infection. It can cause skin rashes and hyperpigmentation. Those are the main side effects. There are always rare side effects associated with any drug.
Is nausea associated with it?
Nausea can be, yes.
Okay. And are you familiar with the dose levels that he has been on throughout his treatment period?
We started him on it, yes.
And at what dose level do you recall?
So we started at 200 milligrams BID. We actually started 200 once a day to see if he would tolerate it, and then went up to 200 twice a day. That medicine dose was continued through our time of watching him. So he started with us in November. I think we started him on December after we got everybody's consent. We increased the dose, I believe, in January, and he stayed on that dose with us from January to May. And then he moved to Tampa.
Okay. And since he moved to Tampa, has his dosage levels changed any?
So they saw him in June, a month after we saw him. And at that point, they stated that they continued the medication at the current dose of 200 BID. However, he appears to have been lost to follow-up after that point, at least by pediatric oncology. So that his next medical record occurred as an assessment in October by pediatric surgery to see that they could attempt the excision of the mass. And between June and October, I am not sure how much Gleevec he was on. Generally, we will stop Gleevec 28 days before surgery because it can impair wound healing. So I imagine his surgery was 11/5. I imagine he stopped it at least at the 1st of October. And then he had his surgery and was not seen by pediatric oncology again until March of 2016. And at that point, they had found that he was not on Gleevec, that he could not tell them when he stopped it. So it was probably before the October dose. And following the surgery, there was a regrowth of the tumor at the surgery site.
Let's go back and talk about that surgery in Florida.
Sure.
Have you read those medical records?
I have.
Do you have an understanding of what Isaiah went through in that surgery?
I do.
Will you describe it, please?
So the surgeon doesn't describe the overall length of his or her incision, actually. So I don't know how extensive the cut was, the surgery that was made. But they went in to try and remove visible masses from the abdominal wall, which they did. And Isaiah tolerated the surgery very well. Unfortunately, on pathology, they did not get what we call negative margins. The surgeon doesn't refer in the op note to what margin she went for. In other words, it doesn't say how far beyond the tumor mass they extended. I was telling you before it was 3 centimeters is the minimum that we do for this tumor. Other sarcomas can be gotten with just 1 centimeter, but this one requires 3. And in her op note, she didn't specify. So I don't know how far beyond the tumor she went. What I can say is that the pathology showed that all margins, meaning all the edges of the resection, still had tumor at the margins, which means that the surgery was ineffective in controlling his tumor at this time.
Okay. So what is Isaiah's current state as of now regarding this tumor?
So following the surgery in November, they had a tumor board at the end of November before he was discharged.
What is a tumor board?
A tumor board is a discussion between oncologists, radiologists, pathologists, surgeons, and anybody who may have a role in taking care of children with cancer. It's generally referred to as a multidisciplinary approach. And almost any center that takes care of pediatric oncology will have regular tumor boards where we can discuss the patients, their goals, and how we are treating them. So it's considered to be a high standard of care, a standard of care for taking care of these complex kids. At their tumor board, they recommended follow-up and Gleevec. It was unclear. There was a question mark next to Gleevec about continuing it, but they did. They restarted the Gleevec after that point. So he had the surgery in November of 2015, right? They talked about Gleevec, and then he was lost to follow-up. And so then he returned in March of 2016, and at that time there was already visible tumor there. They said that we then needed to get an MRI and to assess what was going on. That MRI really wasn't obtained for another 5 months until October, at which point we found that the mass was, of course, continuing to grow. They started Gleevec again in November, and already have documented in December a decrease in the size of the mass. So the tumor had grown pretty extensively by October, and again had a visible mass present. Once they restarted the Gleevec, the mass shrank just as it had when we started the medicine in November or December of 2014 when we first saw him. And so currently he is on Gleevec for an extended period of time.
All right. So let's talk about prognosis. Where does he go from here with his care, and considerably about how he's going to be taking Gleevec or not, or radiation or not, or further surgery?
Right.
I know that that's in the future, but if you had him under treatment for you, tell us where we would go forward.
So from my standpoint, again, I would be using the Gleevec to achieve a maximal shrinkage. I would generally keep him on that for at least a year because we can see long-term changes. We see dramatic changes with the height of the mass dropping and becoming flat. But for those sideways things, in order to shrink it laterally, that takes a lot more time in my experience when I've used this in 5 or 6 other patients. We would give him at least a year. Then I would probably, what happens when we do that is that these areas of discoloration remain on the skin. They would be flat, but they would remain on the skin. And probably I would recommend that we sample at the edges of the tumor on these discolorations to see if there was tumor remaining, either small incisions or small punch biopsies. After that, I would stop the Gleevec in the month preparing for the surgery, and this is all hypothetical. We would do whatever we had to do on the surgery. Okay, so if it meant reconstructing the abdominal wall, we would find people who could do that, because this is his only chance of not having this grow or be more destructive. If we got negative margins and he had the big skin graft or the muscle flap, all that stuff, we would just, I'd let the surgeons deal with and the plastic surgeons deal with. If we got negative margins, we would be done and we would just follow him. If the margins were positive, I would refer him for radiation therapy of pretty much the entire abdominal wall to make sure that we killed all the cancer. And as long as the disease is microscopic, radiation does a very good job. It does not do a very good job. In fact, it doesn't do the job if we can see the disease in a mass. If I can palpate it, if I can feel it, if I can measure it in any way, a circle, then radiation is not adequate for that treatment. And then we would just follow him after the radiation therapy.
Okay. When you said, I don't know if you did say, how often does this cancer metastasize?
So in general, this is a very low risk of metastasis. So I've called this tumor, because it was called in the path report, a giant cell fibroblastoma. This tumor is part of a family of tumors. So if we go back 20 years, we used to call these tumors, this family of tumors, by 5 or 6 different names. And we then, as we got more sophisticated, realized they all have the same genetic change in the tumor, which is kind of like a fingerprint. It kind of tells us that every one of these cancers is actually a different picture of the same cancer. That although they look slightly different, they're all cousins of each other, or brothers and sisters, or they're all related. And so this falls into a large group of tumors called dermatofibrosarcoma protuberans. So
You'll need to spell that.
yeah, dermato, D-E-R-M-A-T-O, fibro, F-I-B-R-O, sarcoma, S-A-R-C-O-M-A, protuberans, P-R-O-T-U-B-E-R-A-N-S. Okay. And so this family of tumors metastasizes at a very low rate, so about 5% in the literature metastasize. So 1 out of 20 patients will develop a metastasis. In my 16 patients, I've had 1 metastasize to the lungs, which is statistically appropriate. And we have scanned, this patient, we scanned him at the beginning of therapy, and his lung CT was negative for metastasis. has not been a further lung evaluation since we evaluated him in November of 2014.
Is the instance, the probability of metastacism greater with a larger tumor that where care is delayed versus a small tumor?
It's very difficult for me to answer that in any kind of significant way. I think as an oncologist, we generally feel the longer that a tumor is in place and the longer that a tumor is allowed to grow, there is more likelihood of gaining that extra ability from for a cancer to spread. So cancers are not stagnant when they first create, when they are first made and start to grow. Cancers continue to mutate. Cancers continue to change. And they develop abilities that they didn't initially have when they were a single cell. The larger the mass, the more cells that are there, which means it's a higher likelihood of being able to spread. As far as I know, he hasn't spread, and there is no concern about this right now. But we do feel in a general sense that there is a higher risk the longer the tumor is there and the more tumor mass that is present.
Okay. And can the cancer grow resistant to this Gleevec?
It has been documented, yes. So the people who have responded to Gleevec at one time begin to not respond to it in the future. Yes, that's been documented.
Is that a danger with Isaiah in that he has been on Gleevec for on and off for about 2 years or more?
Right. I think that the main risk is the fact that he's been on and off, more than the time frame he's been on. It's always a risk with anybody receiving chemotherapy that one of those mutations, one of those changes in the cancer confers resistance to chemotherapy. If you think about somebody with breast cancer or colon cancer, that is the reason they relapse, right? Is that we gave them chemotherapy, we killed all the cells that were sensitive to the chemotherapy. There might have been 10, 100, 1,000 cells, though, that had acquired resistance. And once we kill all the others, those 1,000 cells give rise to the cancer that comes back in 6 months or a year or 2 years. And that is where your relapse comes from. So in his case, it's a risk. I can't tell you statistically what kind of risk that is.
Okay. Isaiah was about 8 years old when you first saw him, is that
Yes.
correct? What would have happened if he never went into treatment until he was 18 years old?
I mean, I don't know that that's... So if these masses are allowed to grow, eventually what I think would have happened is that this might have broken through his skin. The mass may have grown, may have broken through his skin, and at that point you have an open tumor that becomes an infection risk, that becomes potentially painful, although usually not. And at that point, I think he would have had to have sought care. It's hard for me to predict. That's what would have happened locally. I mean, he could have metastasized given another 5 to 10 years, and then we would be dealing with lung lesions that might have had their own impact on him, but I'm not sure I can answer that question.
Okay. Is it possible this cancer will take his life?
It is possible. I mean, either through treatment or through the tumor itself, if we can't resect it. I don't think it's likely. I think that it's a matter of just doing what we have to do in terms of finally getting an extensive enough surgery. We can do it. The problem is that his abdominal wall may suffer cosmetically, mechanically. He may not have much of an abdominal wall after the surgery, and that can lead to complications long term. But I believe that we can cure him of this cancer. It's just a matter of, it's hard to do these large disfiguring resections on a child, and it's hard to get everybody in the same mindset to do it. Unfortunately, that's kind of where he's heading. If we can do it when he's older, if we can hold him on Gleevec and then do it when he's older, when he's achieved full growth, it may be easier. Luckily, with this type of tumor, we have time to wait in general, although there's that small risk of metastasis.
What's the fatality rate for those presentations that are just maybe the size of a quarter, like you said, typically come?
Right. I mean, if we can resect it, the fatality rate is almost zero for those. And in In fact, most of the dermatofibrosarcoma protuberans that lead to death are the ones that are not located on the skin. They're generally developed deep in the body, and they wrap around organs that we can't handle. We can't take the heart out, or we can't take the lungs out. And so that's really where we run into problem with dermatofibrosarcoma protuberans.
Okay, but on this particular type in the skin, the success rate upon early detection is what?
Very high, greater than 90%.
Thank you.
All right, doctor, can you just help me for purposes of the court reporter? You mentioned a generic and a brand name of the medication. Could you spell those for me?
Sure. Imatinib, IMATANIB, and Gleevec, GLEEVEC.
And you mentioned some type of inhibitor that started with a T.
A tyrosine, tyrosine, tyrosine kinase, KINASE, inhibitor.
All right, thank you. All right, Mr. Wimbush, I turn to you for any questions for the doctor. All right, Ms. Wimbush, do you have any questions?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you.
Hi, Mr. Rapkin. Can I approach the,
Yes.
I'd like to look at that, I'd like
Sure.
to kind of show.
If you'll just please refer to the witness as Dr. Rapkin, please. Thank you.
Okay. So, in this,
What would you like me to do?
in this picture, can you explain kind of what, let me start with this first.
Okay.
How much medical history did you have on Isaiah?
I had no medical history on him. All I knew is that Isaiah was in foster care. We had very little to go on after that.
Okay. So you didn't know anything about his parents' medical history or anything like that?
No, ma'am.
Okay. How much research has been done on this particular type of cancer?
So when you ask about research for soft tissue sarcomas, this is a difficult field to research. There have been studies in terms of how to approach the treatment. The one that I use, for example, to base my treatment on Gleevec was out of MD Anderson, probably in the early 2000s, where they took a series of patients who had metastatic dermatofibrosarcoma protuberans and were not amenable to other treatments, and they started them on Gleevec. And that's where I got my 50% response rate from. But this is a rare tumor. Soft tissue sarcomas as a whole are a very mixed group of cancers. And so the studies in adults tend to take 100 different types of soft tissue sarcomas and tends to group them all together and try and research new drugs for all of these. There are about 10,000 cases of soft tissue sarcomas a year throughout the entire United States. There are 360 million people in the United States. That makes for a very rare classification of cancer. Okay. In addition, there are 100 different types of soft tissue sarcoma that fit in those 10,000 cases. So there's not a huge amount of research looking just at dermatofibrosarcoma protuberans. What has been done and what is very clear is that we can link their genetic signature, their fingerprint, because that's been established, that they have a very clear genetic fingerprint. We can establish that they respond to drugs that inhibit certain proteins that are mutated in those cells. And that in case histories, in case series of these patients, where we go back and say, let's pull 30 patients with dermatofibrosarcoma protuberans or 100 patients, those patients, we can see how they do. That's well established.
Can you restrict that to giant cell fibroblastoma?
Well, again, it's an old term that was 15, 20 years ago. In other words, we knew it. We used that term before we identified their fingerprint, before we identified that genetic hallmark of the tumor. Now we know that giant cell fibroblastomas are really a subset of this whole dermatofibrosarcoma protuberans, and they're all treated the same way.
Okay. Has there been any research as to the root cause or where they come from, where they originate from?
Right. I mean, essentially, we would say that that genetic change that we see is the cause of the tumor. In other words, when we start seeing that, it's called a ring chromosome, but when we start seeing that change, that's when the tumor begins to develop, so that the cell undergoes some kind of general genetic change, and that genetic change pushes it to become a cancer.
Okay. And do you have any idea of what causes that change, or?
No. So in kids, I mean, in adults, it's easy to understand why adults get cancer, right? We smoke, we drink, we don't exercise, we eat badly, those kinds of things. And so over 40, 50, 60 years, we acquire damages, genetic damages to our cells because of the things we do, just because of our long lives. For kids, there are 3 million cases of adult cancer a year, but only 12,000 cases of pediatric cancer a year. That's because these are just random bad luck. They haven't had time to damage themselves. So we don't specifically know why it occurs in any given child. We just kind of think of it as random bad luck, that there was something that went wrong in that one cell that started it.
Okay. Has there been, and you may have already answered this, has there been any research as to relating this genetic change to possibly particular foods?
No, not that I know of.
Okay.
No.
Has there, in this type of dermatofibrosarcoma,
Yes.
in this particular type, have you seen cases where it will come up on the skin in a size about like that?
Well, I've taken care of about 16 kids total with this tumor in the last 15 years. And so have I seen circles on the skin? Yes, absolutely. And that's the way the vast majority of these have presented. In general, when you say something like this, what I can't account for is the size. Most of the time, they're much smaller. Some of these are even under a centimeter when they approach a dermatologist and say, can we just get this off? We're not sure what it is. But as I said, this child had the most extensive case I've seen in terms of how big it was at the time when it came to our attention.
And you saw him in November of 2014?
Yes.
That's right. Okay. And you said that when they did the initial resection,
Right.
that they went into the initial scar?
Well, so right here where you see this little round section, Dr. Santori made an incision like this.
Okay.
And he went in and took out the majority of this mass. When I saw him, this mass was not present.
Okay. And that was the mass that he tested?
That was the mass that he tested and was a dermatofibrosarcoma protuberans.
Okay. Have you ever seen a case where it will present in one place and shift to another place?
I've seen areas that are close together but multiple masses. And what's happening, again, as we talked about, is that if it started here, the cells are growing laterally, and when they lodge here, they grow up like this is. So I've certainly seen these tumors have two locations, but generally they're right next to each other, not something where they're on a knee and an elbow, right? Not
Right.
separated in place.
You talked about that there's a very low risk of metastasizing. Will you discuss for all of us what exactly metastasize means?
Sure. So metastasis means spreading, basically, right? So I think most people are aware that when they hear someone talk about cancer, they'll talk about a stage 1, 2, 3, or 4 usually in most adult cancers. And that refers to how extensive the tumor is. And so 1 and 2 are generally referred to as local tumors. They only grow in one place where you see them. And it's really a difference between are they this big or are they this big. Stage 3 means that they've moved to metastasize, they've spread to local lymph nodes, armpit or neck, depending on where it is. Stage 4 means that it's spread much further than that. It can be any organ, like a lung, liver, could be further than that. So other lymph nodes, like in the groin or on the other side, if the tumor is here. It just refers to spreading of the tumor. In this case, the vast majority of these spread to the lungs if they're going to spread.
Okay. And in Isaiah, you didn't see any?
We did a lung CT in November or December of 2014, and that lung CT was negative for any kind of lesions. He had a pneumonia at that time, but he did not have any cancer that we could see in the lung.
You said he had pneumonia?
He had pneumonia at that time.
Okay.
With the CT. He was asymptomatic. He was fine.
Okay. What is the risk of return of these types of sarcoma?
If we don't get it out, 100%. So if we leave any of this tumor behind, it will recur. So that's why it's very important to remove all of it.
And is there a risk of it returning when you do remove all of it? Have you seen it to come back?
In the 16 cases I've had, I've only had one child. He was actually treated in Florida also, but not at this institution, and he was treated by a surgeon. His was present here on the chest wall, and he had about 7 different surgeries that kept getting larger and larger, and each time he recurred at the edge of the surgery. So I have seen a patient have recurrence after surgery, after multiple surgeries. We did one more surgery and then radiated him, and he's doing fine. We haven't seen any recurrence yet.
Okay. So, and you mentioned that this is something where the Gleevec medication could cause it to shrink to be able to await or lay off actual resection. Is that the right terminology?
Right. We would delay the resection because if the Gleevec is working, hopefully the tumor is shrinking, not just in height. I really, to be honest, I don't care about the height of the tumor, the mass. I care about how wide it is. And so hopefully the tumor is shrinking laterally so that our eventual resection can be shorter. So what we do is we put them on Gleevec and then delay, not cancel, but delay the surgery because eventually he's going to need a surgery. And we might reduce it by a couple centimeters. I'm not expecting to reduce it by, 6 inches or 6 centimeters or anything like that.
Okay. And how did Isaiah respond while he was in your care to the Gleevec?
Right. So we saw immediate response to the Gleevec. Within a month to 2 months, we saw a flattening of the lesion. As I said, we weren't able to assess the lateralness of it because, as I told you before we plan a surgery, we might do some sampling along the edge of the discolorations to see if we could find tumor cells there. So we certainly saw a visible reduction in the size of the mass. And that's also been documented by Florida, by Tampa, since they restarted him at the end of last year.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Mr. Mayfield, any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
All right, can Dr. Rapkin be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, he's not going to be subject to being recalled. Do you understand that, Mrs. Wimbush? Yes. Mr. Wimbush? All right, thank you. You are
Thank you very
excused from your
much.
subpoena. Thank you.
Officer Webb.
Good morning, officer.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good, thank you.
Please raise your right hand. Solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the matter now in hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I swear.
What is your name, sir?
I'm Officer Webb, Gwinnett County Police Department.
Are you a post-certified law enforcement officer in the state of Georgia?
Yes, I am.
What does post-certification mean?
It's our police officer selection and training. It's a state certification.
Give him just a moment. I know with all that equipment, sometimes it takes you a
Yes,
minute to
ma'am.
get settled
I'm on,
in.
I'm on call, so that's why my phone's in here, ma'am.
Okay, that's fine. If you could just make sure to give him a chance to get settled.
you, ma'am.
You're welcome. All right, go ahead.
William,
All right. What training are you required to go through before you can obtain? I'm not going to ask you what training is required. What training did you go through in order to become a post-certified law enforcement officer?
go through basic detection classes, investigation classes, Georgia law. Total, I have 1,500 hours of training to this date.
1,500 hours of training?
Yes, sir.
How long have you been a certified officer in the state?
6 years since December.
Okay. All right. Did you attend the Gwinnett County Police Department Academy?
Yes, sir.
How long was that academy?
That academy was 6 months.
All right. On August 22nd, 2012, did you have a reason to encounter Ricardo Wimbush?
Yes, I did.
Will you describe the circumstances that happened?
I was called to the Decula area by an anonymous person who stated they saw a suspicious person, which ended up being a child. They said he was carrying a sleeping bag and walking down the road, and they wanted a police officer to check it out. I was dispatched. I located the
I sustain that objection as to what any anonymous person may have reported. So the jury will disregard any hearsay from an anonymous caller.
Did you receive a radio dispatch to respond to this area for a particular purpose?
Yes.
And what was the purpose?
The purpose was to find a suspicious person walking down the road.
Again, I object, hearsay.
Your Honor, this is not intended for the truth of the matter asserted. It just simply explains conduct as to why it was there.
I overrule it at this point based on communication with dispatch. But officer, don't go into any more specifics from the anonymous caller.
Okay.
So what area did you respond to as a result of that dispatch?
Bailey Woods Road, or Bailey Road. I'll have to check.
Okay. What part of the county is that in?
That's in Decula, Georgia.
All right. Is it inside Gwinnett County?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay. Were you given a description of a person to look for?
Yes.
All right. And did you find someone matching that description?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about that.
It was a black young male carrying a blue sleeping bag.
Okay. Did you have an encounter?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about that. How did that happen?
I saw the kid walking down the road with a sleeping bag. I made contact with him. I asked him, first off, what's your name? He said, I don't know.
I object, hearsay again.
That is not subject to the rules, the hearsay rules, so you can continue. That's overruled.
I made contact with him. I asked his name. He said, I don't know. I said, okay, where are you coming from? He said, I'm coming from an orphanage. I asked how long he'd been walking. He first stated he'd been walking on the streets for 2 months, living off of water and food from passerbyers. And then later I asked him again, and he said that he had been on the streets for a week. I tried to get his name from him, and he gave me the following names, if I may look at my report. He gave me the names of Mike Darvin, with a date of birth of 9/13/2012, Mike Darwin, 9/13/2012, and Kashawn Richards, 3/11/2000. Upon running these in GCIC, which is our database, I was unable to get any kind of information about the kid's identity.
Did he have any identification?
No, sir, he did not have any identification.
Okay. Go ahead.
Being that I noticed the kid was young, I assumed that he wouldn't be given any kind of Georgia ID or anything. The encounter total took about 2 hours, which is not normal for a missing person or a runaway, which I believe I'd come in contact with given the sleeping bag and the time of day. So I, based on the false names, because he had given me 3 different names, none of which came back to anything, and that he gave me 3 names, I put him in the back of my patrol car for false name and date of birth. When I put him in the back of the patrol car, he finally gave me his real name, which is Ricardo Wimbush, and his date of birth, which I was able to, and he gave me his mother's phone number.
Okay. Let's talk about what happened between the first encounter and the time that he finally gave you his name. How long of a period of time did you talk with him between the first encounter and he finally gave his name?
First encounter until he finally gave his name, I believe, is an hour and a half.
Was anyone assisting you in this?
Yes. It was Sergeant Brewster, but he was only there as a sergeant because I was taking custody of a kid, because it wasn't just turning him over to the parents, it was an hour and a half, and due to that, I wanted a supervisor on scene just to make sure I had that authority there with me.
Okay. And what led to him eventually giving his name and his mother's name?
Me taking custody and putting him in the back of the car.
Now, when you did that, did you handcuff him or?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Is that when his attitude changed?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And he told you what exactly? I'm sorry.
It had completely changed. As soon as he got in the back of the patrol car, he told me he was coming from home. He told me his mom's date of birth, and he gave me all the information I needed in order to continue to get in contact with his parents, figure out if he was okay.
All right. Did he give you any information about his home life?
No, sir.
Did he give you any indication of where he was staying inside the home?
No.
Did he give you any indication that he had been abused?
No.
Did you ever contact DFACS during this encounter?
Yes. I did contact DFACS per our policy. Since I did obtain custody of the child for the false name, I called DFACS because that's our policy as soon as we take custody, and because we either are allowed to release them to the parents, and since I wasn't able to get a parent or a name or anything of an actual guardian or parent, I was forced to call DFACS, and I was only able to get a voicemail for them.
Okay. So you left a voicemail for them?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now, was the need for DFACS continuing once you found out who his parents were and where he lived?
No.
Okay.
And the reason being is because that way I can release the child to the parents under a juvenile release form after false name and date of birth complaints were made by me.
All right. So tell me exactly what you charged the child with.
I charged the child with false name and date of birth.
Now, is there a difference between charging a child and charging an adult with something like this?
Yes, there is.
What's the difference?
It's a juvenile complaint, and so it goes through the juvenile courts rather than our actual courts, and he gets released to the parents instead of going to jail or DFACS.
All right. All right, so now you've got his parents' name, address, you've got an accurate name of him, you got his date of birth. What happens next?
I contact the mother, and I advise her, hey, I have your son on the side of the road. He's giving me a false name. I need you to come claim custody of this child.
Okay. What happened next?
She arrived on scene and filled out a juvenile complaint form, which is just a form that says, I understand my son's juvenile complaint has been made against my son, and I'm assuming custody of the son, and she signs a written paper stating that she's taking custody of the kid, and she's also aware of the juvenile court date.
Okay. Was the name of the person that arrived as Ricardo's parent?
Yes.
What was that person's name?
One moment. Darren Wimbush.
All right. Tell me about your conversation with her.
And Mr. Mayfield, I'll need him to testify from his recollection or for you to follow the procedure to refresh his recollection.
Okay. Would it help to refresh your recollection to review your
Yes,
report?
sir, it would.
Okay. See if the report has a notation on that it does in fact
The
refresh your recollection.
when she arrived on scene, all she did was fill a written statement form and claim custody of the kid.
Did she tell you anything about the home life that Ricardo had?
No, sir.
Did she tell you that he had been confined in the basement and was not allowed contact with the other children?
Well, I do find that it is leading, so if you could just rephrase it in a way so it's not leading, I do sustain that objection.
Did she tell you anything about where the child was living in that house?
Other than the address, no, sir.
Did she tell you anything about his interaction with the other siblings?
No, sir.
Did she tell you anything about his behavior, whether it had been good or bad?
She stated that he had run away from home because for bad behavior. He had gotten in trouble.
Did she name what that behavior was?
No, sir.
Did she name what the consequences of his misbehaving would be?
No, sir.
And did you ever have to go to juvenile court on this charge?
No, I did not.
Okay, that's all I have.
Mr. Wimbush, any questions for the officer?
Good morning, Mr. Webb.
Good morning, sir.
Yes, Officer Webb, please.
Officer Webb, I'm sorry. When you came in contact with Ricardo, did he have any bruises, marks, anything?
Nothing that I saw.
Okay. What was he wearing?
I'd have to look at my report to remember exactly what he was wearing.
Could I see the report as well?
Yes, after I'm done, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Blue gym shorts, a blue shirt, and a sleeping bag.
Okay. All right. Did he seem like he was troubled or he was distraught or anything?
I don't remember.
Okay. You say he gave you the correct name once you put him into the car?
Yes.
The car? And was he nervous when you put him in there, or was he?
He had been given the false name and everything. It was hard to get any information, but once I put him in the back of the patrol car, his whole attitude changed, and he, for lack of a better term, he became compliant and was immediately giving all the information I needed in order to go through with getting him to the place he needed to be.
Okay. And what was he like when his mom showed up?
I don't remember.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Wimbush, questions for the officer?
Ma'am.
Do you remember what you told Ricardo when he got out of the car?
No, ma'am, I do not.
You don't?
No, ma'am.
You said that his attitude changed once you put him in the back of the car. Can you describe what his attitude was like before? I mean, you mentioned non-compliant, but can you kind of explain what his attitude was?
Yes, ma'am. It's based on my experience when I come in contact with kids. This kind of call is very fast for that. When they come in contact with police officers, they usually really want to give me their name, date of birth, where they live. This one was very different because this call had actually taken 2 hours, which is not normal. So me asking a child for his name and just continually lying and giving me false information is very different. And then once I put him in the back of the patrol car, the attitude changed, and every question I asked was a straightforward, truthful answer.
So in your experience, from your experience, did it appear that once Ricardo understood that there were going to be consequences for his lying to you, then he became compliant?
Maybe. It's hard to tell, but I do know that once he was in the back of the patrol car, he told the truth on everything.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any redirect, Mr. Mayfield?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Officer Webb, can he be excused from his subpoena?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any objection to him being excused?
No objection.
All right, thank you. You're excused. Thank you, sir. Ready for your next witness?
Your Honor, I need just a couple of minutes for my next witness.
All right, this may be a good time for the morning break, ladies and gentlemen. Will 15 minutes be sufficient, Mr. Mayfield?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, let's take our mid-morning break, 15 minutes, and I will continue to remind you of your precautionary instructions during the break. 15-minute recess.